Hi everybody and welcome back to Geektube Central and our Game of Thrones Season 7 review. Going into episode 2, I really thought we were mostly going to be just continuing plot development, moving characters across the board, setting up future sort of storylines that will all converge together to get us to the finale episode of this season. I didn't actually think shit was going to be blowing up and things were going to be all over the place, and just when you thought you knew what was going to happen, you get caught off guard. But that's not like a new thing in Game of Thrones, but for episode 2 there was so much stuff going on and you realise plot points and character points that it's quite dramatic. It's like an episode 9 episode where usually lots of hairy shit happens, like the Red Wedding and such. So let's just get straight into the episode. So we pick up where we left off last week. We're on Dragonstone and it's dark and it's raining. It's not very a good, nice homecoming for Daenerys, and she even says that, you know, oh what a homecoming this is. And you're kind of like, why does she seem so bitchy? She seems like she's ready to tear into someone. And Tyrion is being the voice of reason, saying, you know, we won't be here long, it's just we've got to plan out our way. And she chooses this moment to pick on Varys. Now I mean pick on it because I really do think that she's got a goal to bring this up. Yes, he served under her father, yes, he served under King Robert and then all those Joffrey and all that entails and everything, right? But he quite rightly says, I do what I have to do for the people, for the real people, because I came from nothing. I was a slave, then I was chopped up as an offering and thrown on the scrap heap. I managed to make the best out of my own situation. And yes, I served under your father. He wasn't a good king. Robert wasn't a great king. He wasn't really interested in being king. He was all about overthrowing a tyrant and getting revenge, and when the smoke cleared he was the one crowned. But he himself at least had the decency to say he's no king. So Varys getting cornered on his loyalty, and Tyrion is standing by him. He says, you know, if it wasn't for him I would be drinking myself into an early grave. If it wasn't for him you wouldn't have the Dornish, you wouldn't have the Tyrells. All true points. And Daenerys just has this cob on. She's reliving. She even says the line from season 1 about how everybody in Westeros was drinking secret toasts to our brother's health, and she brings this up to Varys. Oh, they waiting for me kind of thing. So she starts to rehash stuff, and she's like, well, you know, I was who made the order for trying to kill me last, you know, like season 1? And he says, King Robert. And I says, but I bet you it was you that did all the your little birds, you set up the assassins. And he quite rightly turns around and said, well, you know, what am I supposed to do? I either die or I serve. So I served and I made the best of it. But even though he was initially going to support her brother, Viserys, because he was the eldest Targaryen, it obviously turned out that he wasn't suitable, and she sort of rose from her meagre position as basically a brood mare and a chip for Viserys to barter. But obviously she came out on top and she's a great person, and he says that. He says, you're going to be great, I support you, but I'm not going to give you blind loyalty. So in the end they kind of make up that if she ever becomes a bad ruler and fails the people, that he would promise to tell her. Otherwise, if he goes behind her back like he'd done before, she'll just feed him to our dragons. So that was a nice little touch. We then cut to Grey Worm announcing to everybody that a Red Priestess has arrived to come and see the Dragon Queen. And it's, of course, Melisandre, right? And they're in the they're in the throne room, and it's looking good, by the way. We see that despite being banished by Jon Snow last season, she's obviously still working on his behalf, and I suppose this way she's trying to prove it to who she thinks is going to rule the kingdom, but also she needs that person to understand there's a bigger war at stake than just overthrowing the Lannisters. And she says that she is here because of the prince that is promised, and how that person is going to be the deciding factor on the war with the White Walkers. Of course, Daenerys is like, well, I'm not exactly a prince. And Missandei, who is better at High Valyrian, says, well, actually, prince doesn't have a gender. It can be prince or princess, which also opens up another who is that going to be question. So Daenerys is happy to hear this, and when Jon Snow is brought up, she says, I believe you and the fate of another are together entwined, and she mentions about Jon Snow, and she doesn't know anything about Jon Snow except for he's now called the King in the North, much like it was pre-Targaryen conquest. At this point, Tyrion chimes up and says, well, you know, I met Jon Snow and he's a great guy. This is the opportunity for a letter to be sent, a raven to be sent to Winterfell, announcing Daenerys is here, she wants you to come bend the knee. And Tyrion, you can see, because of how his family has suffered in these last few years, that he probably won't appreciate that. So you see that what comes into play later is that Tyrion helps word the message to Jon. We then move on to what their plan is. Now, they're beside this map table for a reason. The plan is that she doesn't want to be the Queen of the Ashes, right? That's what Tyrion brings up because he's the voice of reason. That the best way to go around conquering King's Landing without killing all the people and alienating the rest of the people, she has to overthrow Cersei, who only has about half the kingdom on her side. The rest of the lords are pissed at her. She's obviously proven that she's duplicitous. The way she did it was just so dramatic that she's not really going to have trust. So she's at this point ruling by fear. So the plan is that they want to send in Westerosi armies, arses I almost said, to go in and overthrow King's Landing. Then that would mean it would be the Greyjoys and the Dornish and the Tyrells. Now, of course, Arya Sand pipes up and says, oh yeah, that's great, we all go and do the hard work. What was the point of even bringing the Dothraki and the Unsullied? Good, valid question. But Tyrion says, quite rightly, what? If we send in foreign armies, and bear in mind that the Dothraki have a really scary rep for the way they operate in Essos, and this is the first time they've ever left that continent, that if they bring them in, oh sure, they'll be able to conquer King's Landing, but there's going to be carnage. And whoever's left standing is not going to be exactly grateful that they didn't die, and they're going to be scared of them. So the best thing is to do a strategic army strike, much like what Stannis did. He had a claim, and he used his army that he amassed to go on King's Landing. Unfortunately, Tyrion was on the other side, and that's what scuppered that. So Tyrion's idea is we send in the Greyjoys, the Tyrells, the Dornish to go in, and that will be less severe. So what is the point of the Unsullied and the Dothraki? Now this is where you curry favour with Arya Stan, because he's actually the one to lay out the plan for what's going to happen to Casterly Rock. He's going to send the Unsullied and the Dothraki to basically overthrow and take that stronghold. So if they take that, and he's the one that orchestrated it as a Lannister, it shows you that he's thought this all out, and that actually makes Arya Sand and others go, that is in fact a good idea. So Dany asks if she has their support, and Yara says yes, you have ours, and Ilaria says you have Dorne, and of course Lady Olenna just nods because she's just that cool. It then moves off that she asks to speak alone with Lady Olenna, and Daenerys says, I know you're not here out of love for me, but a promise will make Cersei pay and will bring back peace to Westeros. And Lady Olenna, not missing her trick, says, "Is that what you think we had under your father? Or his father? Or his father? Peace never lasts. How do you think I became an old woman? Because I ignored the words of men, like lords that have came and go. You know, they've all came and go, and I'm still here. Taking a bit of advice. Your hand is really smart and everything, but sometimes you just have to ignore what other people say, because at the end of the day, men are sheep. The lords of Westeros are sheep, you know, the people in power. And you're not a sheep. You're a dragon. So be a dragon." And that is very telling, and quite rightly, maybe she should look at the best parts of what being a Targaryen meant for the Seven Kingdoms. It united them. She needs to bring order and some sort of resemblance of peace, but a united peace, but basically build on that. Now, I'm going to mention this briefly, that we also see this scene between Worm and Missandei, and you can see that he's going to be leaving for Casterly Rock, and she's obviously, she cares for him, he cares for her, and that's when he gives his own version of a declaration for love about how he's never been fearful, and because he's never been fearful, he's always been really good at what he does, and that she has made him fearful because he doesn't want to go there and die and not come back to her. So that leads to the obligatory sex scene. Yes, he's a eunuch, but obviously he has skills. He's probably up there trying to take Jon Snow's magic tongue title away from him. But it is sweet, but yet again, I'm not really a big fan of this storyline. It's not bad, it's just I want more of the other main storylines, seeing as we're only getting 7 episodes. We then move across to King's Landing, where Cersei is holding her own court. Now, she has a group of lords there, right? It's not that many, but I digress. So she's on the throne, she's got Jaime at one side, Qyburn at the other, and she's basically going, "We have to protect ourselves. I need you all behind me because Daenerys, the Dragon Queen, is coming, and she's going to be bringing a horde with her. She's bringing these horrible Dothraki that they've only ever heard of, that they're going to come, they're going to rape, kill, enslave, you know, the whole 9 yards. Worse than that is that she's got the traitors from the south like Lady Olenna and House Tyrell, the Dornish as well, who she absolutely hates because of Marcella being murdered, quite rightly, and how at the top of it you can't trust the Dragon Queen. She's the worst of all of them. She has 3 dragons, but more than that, when she was in Meereen, she killed all these lords and basically crucified them, and anybody that goes against her, she's gonna wipe them all out. So I need you lords to come together and help me protect Westeros, because I'm the only one that can do it. That's me adding her own sarky voice in there. So of course, Lord Tarly walks forward and he says, "What about the dragons? She has 3 fully grown dragons, just like Aegon did." And you don't really need to go into it, but well, Aegon came with 3 dragons. He ended up roasting all these all these people that wouldn't bend the knee, and then in the end, basically all 6 of the kingdoms grouped together before they eventually conquered Dorne through a marriage, right? So he quite rightly says, "What are you gonna do against dragons?" And you watch Cersei's eye, she doesn't move her head, she just moves her eyes to look over at Qyburn, and he says, "Well, we've got a solution for that. We're working on it." We then move on to a short scene where Jaime goes to speak to Randall Tarly, aka Sam's dad. He also is introduced to his son, Dickon, who's now his heir, and talking about how he needs to know what Randall Tarly's going to do. And Randall Tarly says, "Well, I'm going to go home to Hornhill and mobilise the army like he's supposed to do, because, you know, the fighting's going to happen soon." And at that, Jaime's like, "So are you going to be on our side or their side? Because our side is the right side and we're going to protect the people from all of these savages and eunuchs. And I mean, how could you trust someone that would bring the Dothraki horde to Westeros for the first time ever? And of course, Randall Tarley's not one to mince words. He basically straight up says, well, how am I supposed to side with an oathbreaker that would stab their king in the back or slit the throats of guests at weddings? And obviously the unsaid thing, blow up a freaking national monument, a national place with lots of his own kin and family alliances are with. So Lady Olenna does get mentioned, and he says, well, I've known her since I was a child and I swore fealty to her. But Jaime says, well, you know, you also swore fealty to the crown, aka Cersei, and anyway, Lady Olenna's broken, so that means that we'll be needing a new Warden of the South. It doesn't end with a yes or a no, but you kind of take it that Randyll Tarley is basically going to try and preserve his house, and the best way is to hedge his bets and stick with the crown. I mean, after all, he took the call to come and see her at King's Landing. We then see Qyburn and Cersei going down into this dank cellar, and Qyburn asks her if she's ever been down here. Here being the cellar that is filled with old Targaryen dragon skulls. You actually even see like not a banner, but a big piece of cloth with Targaryen symbol over some, I assume, smaller skulls. And they stop in front of this ginormous skull. And of course you realise that this must be a special one, and that's when Qyburn says, you know, this is Balerion the Black. I will give him his full title, can't help it if that he even doesn't know the name. It's Balerion the Black Dread. Little history on Balerion. He was the dragon that Aegon rode when he conquered Westeros. Balerion was so big, his wingspan could cover whole cities, and towns I should say. And black, not just a name, they actually say that his fire that he breathed was black. This was such a brilliant dragon that it died of old age. It was about 200 years old. Other dragons died in combat, other dragons later on didn't grow so big, but this is a special dragon. So we'll get back to it. Cersei's basically throwing shade about how Robert used to come down here because this was his trophies. He probably even brought some of his whores down here to freaking have coitus, as they say. And that's when Qyburn says that he's had men working on this day and night, and you see it's this giant ballista, basically a huge crossbow. And he mentions how one of Daenerys' dragons, aka Drogon, was injured in a fight in pits in Marine, and if it can be injured, it can die. So he tells her to pull a lever. The lever produces this giant bolt. It hits Balerion skulls right between the eyes. Of course it looks dramatic, but I'm just going to say, right, for one thing, you're not going to get a dragon to just sit still and let you shoot it. You've got the hide, the muscle, and the size. I'm sure it could do some damage, but bear in mind, Balerion's skull has been like that for many, many years. I'd say, I think it's over 200 years. And over time, calcification bone would probably weaken, so the fact that it looked so good when she pulled the bolt doesn't necessarily mean it's going to do that to Drogon. But that we'll find out about later. So we move over from King's Landing to Old Town in the Reach, where Sam is with the Archmaester basically doing Jorah's assessment. Now, the Archmaester said if he was smart, he would have cut off his arm as soon as he was infected, because basically it's too late, it's quite advanced, it might take 10-20 years before it fully covers you, but it'll be less than 6 months before he loses his sanity. And although Sam fights hard for his case to try and help Ser Jorah, the Archmaester says, you know, if you were a common person, I would just ship you off to be with the Stone Men, but because you're an anointed knight, I'll give you one more day. And after he leaves, Ser Jorah sat there kind of defeated, and Sam asks if he wants him to contact his family. And that's when he gets his name for the first time, Jorah Mormont. And obviously Sam knows who that is. Cut to later, the Archmaester shoots down Sam some more about 2 known cases of advanced grayscale getting cured, but the guy that wrote the book also died from it. Cut to later, and Ser Jorah is kind of accepting his fate, and he's writing a letter to Daenerys, and here's the letter. It's everything you expect from someone so noble as Ser Jorah. So Sam later in the dead of night comes through with a cart covered in medicines and stuff. He's brought his scalpels and all these other things, and a big, you know, a rum skin, and he says to Ser Jorah, drink all this up, you're going to need it. Gives him a twig to bite on, and then heads into one of the most disgusting things you're ever going to see, and he literally starts to slice off the grayscale. Now there's an interesting part where Sam says, you're not going to die today, Jorah Mormont, because it actually plays back to before when Sam got the same words from Ser Jorah, the Lord Commander, saying, you're not going to die today, Sam Tarly. So it's quite nice. I think he feels like, you know, I'm a bit beholden, I want to help him. It also makes you think, well, why didn't the other people cut off the grayscale and it would probably be easier? It's because nobody wants to go near you. You're going to have to wear gloves and everything's going to be sterile, and as he's hacking off the grayscale there's pus underneath it, so you're going to have to scrape all that off, then use the ointment to try and clean him up. Now I think the reason why it can work at this stage is because it takes a while before it starts to turn into like the scabs over your body. It's kind of like when you get 3rd degree burns and then the skin starts to decolour and it changes sort of texture. So it's easier to take off, probably the reason why after 3rd degree burns you're given skin grafts. So in this case there's not going to be any skin grafts, but he's going to try his best. Now I'm hopeful that Sam's going to do this because quite frankly we need to see Ser Jorah with his Khaleesi. We then see Sam go at him again, getting ready to cut off some more scabs and grayscale, and then it cuts to the most disgusting transition, seamless I might add, of this pie and a spoon going in and pulling out creamy sauce. And you're like, ugh, probably a chicken pie. So she's listening to the person eating the pie talking about how Daenerys is dragons, she's got 3 of them and they're huge, and the other guy's like, oh, it's a lot of shite. They're probably, but she's listening to the gossip, as you kind of say. And as she's sitting there, she looks up and you see Hot Pie, and Hot Pie's got this nice big tray and it's got a jug of ale and 2 pies, and he says, Arya, and he sits down with her. And she doesn't even wait for him to answer. She takes one of the pies and starts eating. And he mentions about how he does his pies and how he browns the butter. And she said, just right off the cuff, oh, I didn't do that when I made pies. And he was surprised by that. But of course we know what kind of pie she liked to make, which was Frey pies. So she's eating, she's drinking the ale, and she seems kind of like emotionless. She seems quite matter of fact, and it's kind of sad because she's still a child, right? She's not fully grown woman yet. But when Hot Pie mentions, oh, you going to Winterfell, and she just comes straight off, and it's kind of like a sad way she says it, but also unemotional, and she says, why would I go back there? You know, the Boltons are there. And he says, no, the Boltons are dead. Didn't you know your brother won the Battle of the Bastards and now he's King of the North? And of course, that's when more of the emotional Arya comes in, and she's like, you're lying. He says, why would I lie about that? So she fills up an ale and she says goodbye to Hot Pie. It's a nice being able to see someone. You can tell he's basically a plot device just so that he can tell Arya the news so that she'll not go to King's Landing, because when he asked her where she was going, she said she was going to King's Landing, and once she finds out that Jon's alive, that the Winterfell's back in a Stark's hands, you can tell that her attitude's changed, and when she's leaving she says, just make sure you don't get killed, and he says, it's alright, I'm a survivor just like you. And as she's climbing up on her horse, there's a cart, I think it's the same two people that was eating their pie, and they're heading to King's Landing. They say, oh, I hope it'll be alright when we get to King's Landing, blah blah blah. And she can see them leaving one way, so you know the other way behind her is to the north. And for a moment she hesitates, but she turns and she starts to move, and she's not just trotting, little gandery trot, she's starting to really go for it, and you're like, oh yes, just get home, get home, get home. It then cuts to her obviously having a bit of a break because it's a long journey, and she's setting up the campfire, and her horse is starting to stir. When your horse starts to get, you know, agitated, you know stuff's on. And before she knows it, she's surrounded by all these wolves. And when you see these wolves and they're pulling back their teeth, pulling back their lips, I suppose you can say, and they're snarling, and they look like quite vampiric, and you're like, oh my god, they're going to tear her to bits, whether or not she's a Stark or Winterfell or not. And she's obviously surrounded, she's got needle out, and then you see a change in the wolves. They start to lower their heads, and you get the presence. We get to see this giant wolf, and you turn round and it's not a wolf. All the wolves are about the same size, fully grown. This is a dire wolf, and not just any dire wolf, it's Nymeria, and I swear to Christ, and they don't use enough of the CGI for these dire wolves. We haven't seen ghosts so far, and Nymeria is so freaking tall, you could probably strap a saddle on her and ride her like a horse. And she's quite aggressive at first, again with her lips drawn back into a snarl, and her teeth are on display. And when Arya says her name and comes closer, she drops needle, and you see the change, and it zooms in on those beautiful, beautiful eyes, and there's a recognition there. And Arya says, I'm going home, girl. And she's like, come with me. And for a minute the softness makes you think, oh my god, we're going to take this Nymeria back with us, we're going to have actual wolves, and we're going to have a pack. And then she just turns, and you can see Arya really, really upset. When I first watched it, I was quite upset, because I was like, I want a reunion, and I want Nymeria to come back, seeing as we've lost so many freaking direwolves already. But when Nymeria and her pack leave, and that's how the episode ends. Now, I know I don't do these reviews in order, but the importance is how sad it is for Arya. I suppose it's just nice to see her being sad, because she's been so emotionless, and she seems to just be tuned into vengeance and all that entails. So when you see her be a bit vulnerable, you're like, I kind of am glad to see it, because you don't want her to turn into like this automaton. But I'm telling you, we're going to see those wolves and that beautiful dire wolf yet again. Just you wait, just you see. I'm calling it right now. We then move over to Winterfell, where we see that there's a lot of training going on. And in amongst this, Sir Davos, Jon and Sansa are mulling over this raven that was sent by Daenerys. Actually, it was written by Tyrion. And it ends with, I appeal to you, one bastard to another, for all dwarves are bastards in their father's eyes. Now that's just his way of proving that it's definitely him, and Jon says that. He says, well, that's the thing he said to me the night we first met. And of course, you're mulling over the reasons why you shouldn't listen to it, you shouldn't go. And quite rightly, Sir Davos brings up, you know, she's got 3 dragons. And what do we know that can kill whites? Fire. So you can see that that's something they're considering. And we cut to later, and the Maester brings Jon a message. And next scene we see Jon telling all the lords in the hall that he received a letter from Sam, and it said that there's a whole cache of dragonglass under Dragonstone. He then pulls out another message that he said he's had for a few days, and that it's from Tyrion Lannister, who is now the hand of the Queen, and she's invited me to come and see her. Now, obviously there's all this furore and everything, because remember, going south has never been really good for any Stark. I mean, Robb went south and died, his dad went south and died, the granddad and the uncle went south. So basically going south is another metaphor for going south in the north. And we even have little lady Lyanna Mormont saying, no, you need to be here, this is the north, you're supposed to stay here. Sansa's at him to stay. The man from the Eyrie says, no, you should stay, you shouldn't trust a Targaryen. But he basically talks them down and says, we have to think long and hard, because at the end of the day we need strong allies, and she's a strong ally. She's got a great army behind her, and if it's to be believed, 3 dragons. Of course, dragons is never a good thing brought up because of the Mad King, and even Sansa goes, look what her father did to our grandfather and our uncle. All very true, valid points. But in the end he says, I have to get allies and I'm going to ride south. And Sansa's like, well, why don't you send an emissary? He says, no, only a king can meet with a queen. And don't worry, the north is going to be in safe hands. And she's like, whose? Yours. And he says, the north is yours. Cue creepy view of Littlefinger sort of mulling that over, because he'll have time to himself with Sansa, which is never good. We then get a long overdue scene where we get to see Ned Stark's crypt, and it's a beautiful statue, and Jon's there contemplating everything, and Littlefinger shows up and goes on about how he was the one that brought his bones back to Cat as a gift from Tyrion Lannister, and oh, send him my best when you go and see him. Me and your father never got on well, but we both loved Cat. She never liked you, did she? And you see Jon smile, kind of that grim smile, like, just wait for it. And he says, well, I love Sansa just like I loved our mother. And of course that's the moment when Jon just loses it, pins him by the throat, very reminiscent of season 1 when Ned pins Littlefinger. And Jon says, if you go near my sister, I'll kill you myself. And Littlefinger wonders why he isn't more grateful to him for bringing him all those soldiers at the Battle of the Bastards. I'm pretty sure he's just proved that he is a slimy little ass. Immediately after choking out Littlefinger, he leaves the crypts, walks by 2 beheaded direwolf statues, climbs up on his horse, looks to Sansa, waves, and leaves with Sir Davos and a small retinue of bannermen. And as he leaves, you see Littlefinger come up from the crypt, clutching at his throat, and then he looks at where Jon was and then looks up at Sansa. Again, creepy dick. We then move on to our climax, where somewhere in the Narrow Sea, the Greyjoys, the Dornish, you know, the Sand Snakes, whatever, they're on their ships, and we see a bit of levity. We see the 3 Sand Snakes in their little hammocks, and they're both picking over who's going to get Cersei first, and who's going to do this, and they kind of start picking on Tyene Sand, which is the youngest one, and she keeps bringing up her mama, and they're using that against her, going, mama, mama. And she turns around and says, you know, maybe I'll, you know, kill you both so I won't have to share who I kill when we get to King's Landing. Of course you're like, oh, poor sweet darling, that's going to come back to bite you. Always watch what you say. It then cuts to somewhere else on the ship where Ellaria Sand and Yara are drinking beer, and Elaria's not impressed with it, and we then move on to this flirting scene, and you see Theon get really, really uncomfortable, and just as he leaves, they're getting into the whole kissing each other. We've seen this in the trailer before. And then all of a sudden we hear a thud, a heavy hit, and as Yara runs up the stairs with Theon, they look out, and through this dark mists comes the Silence, which is Euron's ship. So music tempo changes, everything's hitting the fan. Euron's gangplank comes crashing down on one Iron Islander, and then he just starts boarding, and he looks crazy as all out hell. he starts going for everybody, and they're cutting bloody swathes through everybody, and his men start to pile on the boat, and things are going down. There's a point where Theon and Yara start to fight, and then you see Tyene throw one of her swords, well, her knives, at someone, and then as she retrieves the knife, Yara tells her to go downstairs, her mother's there. So then Theon, hacking a bloody swathe for everybody, he's not just over there and we're just waiting for the climactic scene, he's straight in. First Sand Snake, Obara. He starts fighting with her, she's all kung fu and everything, and he gives her a slap, a proper scud in the face, and when she comes at him with her spear, he manages to disarm her, break it in half, and then impale her with both pieces of the spear. Either way, she's been done. You see Nymeria, she starts screaming and she comes over. Now her big weapon thing is she's all Indiana Jones with a whip, and she gets in a few good licks, but unfortunately for her she is not Indiana Jones, and then Euron takes her whip and strangles her with it. Below decks, Tyene Sand is doing pretty well with her blades. She gets in some good licks, but unfortunately her and her mother are overwhelmed, and just when Alaria starts screaming kill us, you realise that they have other plans for those two. We then see that all the other Greyjoy ships around them are all being set alight, being sunk. It all looks really, really hopeless. And Yara, not one to run away from the fray, she full on jumps from one part of the deck onto the ground, and she starts to fight Euron. And Yara is given as good as she's getting, and the fight goes on for a lot longer than it did with anybody else. But unfortunately, like an explosion rocks her from underneath her feet, and she's sort of thrown a little, and then that's when Euron takes advantage of it, and he ends up getting her, and he has his sort of weird tentacle axe thing right at her throat, and then he calls over Theon. Now Theon at this point is obviously Theon at this point, he's doing his own fighting, and then when he sees that his sister's captured, and obviously Euron's calling him a cockless cunt and everything, cockless coward I should say, and there's this moment of panic. He looks and he sees all of his Greyjoys being mutilated, and you see this change in Theon. His eyes get a bit wild and you can see he's frightened, and when he looks over at his sister, there's this moment of, well, we know we're both going to die, let's just get this over with. Or maybe she starts to see in his eyes the fear, and then he takes that moment and just jumps off the ship. Now, I've got two theories of thought on this. Either he was wise to go, well, we've always got to try and make sure that there is at least one Greyjoy out free, and that he can always come back and rescue her, or he literally just jumped because he was scared. But with insurmountable odds, and considering how badly tortured he was with Ramsay, you'd think there couldn't be any worse thing you can do than demasculize a person or break them down with torture, but he's obviously that afraid that he has ran away to think again, kind of thing. And you're just left wondering, well, that was an unexpected battle scene that I didn't see coming in episode 2, but then again, season 7 is all up in the air, and we'll just have to see how this all plays out. So, what an episode that was. I have to admit that the ending in the Narrow Sea with Theon, Yara, the Sand Snakes, Alaria, and obviously the nutjob that is Euron Greyjoy, I didn't expect that, but I really appreciated having that really dramatic end scene with a battle on the seas, because to be brutally honest, the Greyjoys have been kind of underused, and obviously they're making up with it now with Euron. The fact that 2 of the Sand Snakes are dead, I wasn't that surprised, because if you watched my previous video on predictions, I told why I thought this was going to happen. I had a funny feeling when I saw a certain sneak peek video that you only see Alaria and Tyene Sand after this point, and you don't actually see Nymeria and Obara. It's because plot wise they've got rid of them It's like, for all the sins of the Sand Snakes and the whole Dornish storyline, it's kind of like they went, well, we're just going to get rid of them. And I also know that the actress that plays Nymeria Sand is really busy schedule-wise. That's why she could only really allow one episode sort of to basically end her character involvement. So that ties that up quite neat. I like the Winterfell scenes, but at the same time I'm kind of annoyed by the whole Littlefinger thing. I'm just waiting for somebody to take their big finger and grasp it around a knife and stab him right in the chest. The best part, I think, was seeing how Samwell Tarly and Jorah Mormont came together, and we're now going to get someone back for Team Daenerys, seeing as we've lost quite a lot so far. Speaking of Daenerys, I've been a fan of her since the start, but I have this whole Neo from the Matrix theory on certain characters. When you saw Neo in the Matrix series, in the first one he seems very human, very fallible. You get to learn the kind of person he is and how you've got to see him transform into this powerful person at the end, who in the end believes he's the one. Great! But then you cut to the next two movies, he's like an automaton, and it's like, oh, so now he's the one, all of a sudden all the interesting things about him are gone, and now he just seems to be a bit of an ass. Now, I'm not saying Daenerys is all the way there, but the way she went on at Varys... Now, I understand that she has a chip on her shoulder about how Robert Baratheon organised her attempted assassination, and that he'd had it in from her from the minute she was a baby. And yes, Varys was working under Robert Baratheon, but he also worked under her father. He understands that, you know, it's one thing to serve someone, but at the end of the day, you've got to take care of yourself. And I'm not going to, he says, I'm not going to give blind loyalty to you. So in the end, they come to this sort of halfway point where he promises to tell her where she's going wrong, and if he betrays her, she's quite happy to feed him to the dragons. And that makes sense. The whole plotline where she's going to be sending the Unsullied and the Dothraki to Casterly Rock, that actually I thought was a very clever strategy. And the scene with Grey Worm and Missandei, I'm not saying it's gratuitous, it's overindulgent. I understand there's a love story there, but I just, as a person and as a viewer, I kind of see that as really low on the totem pole. But I can understand it's the whole link that someone will really miss Grey Worm, and not just as the head of the Unsullied. The scene with Arya and Nymeria, I kind of suspected that it was going to happen this season. I had been looking around about the people that hire wolves to play in the show, and I'd seen that it was alluded to, and I was like, yes, we're going to get a really great scene. And I'll admit, I was bitterly disappointed that Nymeria turned tail and left their pack, but I still see this as a watch this space kind of moment. Cersei will end with this. I see that she's trying to get people on her side, and they're kind of reticent because, you know, she's a despot really. But unlike what happened with Daenerys, who seemed to have earned a lot of respect and had a lot of different factions coming together under her, it seems that unfortunately Cersei's landed the first blow, and it is quite devastating, and it's not going to end there. And the whole scene about the dragon and the ballista, yes, it's probably foreshadowing that they're going to try and use it, but I don't really at this point see that they're going to get the upper hand that way. I think it's going to eventually turn around, because I think what we need to understand here is that men on men, there's always going to be somebody that loses, and not necessarily the person that has the most people and the most on their side, and that good on their side will not always win, as we've seen with what happened with the Dornish and the Greyjoys. But when you add dragons into the mix, I think that that will still be Dany's shining glory, her children, because every season since they've gotten bigger, whenever she's looked at her dragons have always, you know, stepped up or flew up and managed to show their might with very little effort compared to the might of man. I think it's basically showing that deep down this connection between Dany and her dragons is her most emotional part to her, and I still absolutely love the whole storyline with her and her dragons. But in saying that, I find that since seeing Nymeria come back this episode, I really wish for more direwolf action, and I'm really quite disappointed that that Ghost hasn't shown up this season, not once. And God knows where he is. Maybe he's just hanging out with maybe Ramsay's dogs or something, I don't know. But overall, I really enjoyed the episode. It's really lots of stuff firing off, and you're kind of like, oh my god, I can't. That's the problem with it, is I enjoy the episode, and each little bit that you're getting story-wise, you're like, oh, this is great, but you're always desperate for more, and you're like, I can't wait for next week, which I can. And obviously, if you're watching this and you see the date time on it, I am really late with it. I'm very sorry. I've been kind of a little behind on my game kind of thing. But I'm really looking forward to producing the episode 3 video, The Queen's Justice.